Hey there, mystery seekers. Today we're talking about the one place on Earth where 54 countries, including ones that couldn't agree on what day of the week it is, suddenly decided to play nice and sign a treaty saying, nobody owns this, nobody touches that. I'm talking about Antarctica, the frozen continent that's supposedly just a big ice cube for scientists to study penguins on. Except here's the thing. There's a whole lot more going on down there than awkward birds sliding around on their bellies. And some of it is so strange that even mentioning it gets people nervous. We're about to dig into maps that shouldn't exist, lakes buried under miles of ice that nobody wants to talk about, and military operations that got cut short for reasons that make zero sense. Before we dive into this frozen rabbit hole, smash that like button if you're ready for some seriously weird history, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if anyone out there is actually in Antarctica right now, because that would be wild. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear might just change how you look at that big white blob at the bottom of every world map. Let's get into it. So let's start with the basics, because Antarctica isn't just some oversized ice cube floating at the bottom of the planet. We're talking about a landmass roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined, covered in ice that's over 2.5 miles thick in some places. 2.5 miles. That's not just impressive. That's the kind of thickness that makes you wonder what exactly it's been hiding all this time. And here's where things get interesting in that, wait, what kind of way. For a place that's supposedly been frozen solid for tens of millions of years, Antarctica has a remarkably suspicious number of things going on that don't quite add up. Think about it. We've mapped the ocean floor in more detail than we've explored this continent. We've sent robots to Mars and taken better photos of distant galaxies than we have of certain parts of Antarctica. Which, makes perfect sense when you consider that Mars is only about 140 million miles away, while Antarctica requires you to actually go there in person. The logic is flawless, really. But the strange part isn't just that we haven't fully explored it. It's that there are entire zones of this continent where exploration is actively discouraged, cordoned off, and in some cases, flat out prohibited. Not because of dangerous wildlife or treacherous terrain, mind you, but because of international agreements that everyone seems oddly eager to follow. When was the last time you saw 54 countries agree on literally anything? These are nations that can't even agree on what to call certain bodies of water, yet they all signed on the dotted line when it came to keeping parts of Antarctica off limits. Now, before we dive deeper into the modern weirdness, we need to talk about something that happened way back in 1513. Yes, we're jumping back 500 years, because that's when a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis, who probably had better things to do than cause headaches for future historians, created a map. Not just any map, though. This was a map that showed the coastline of Antarctica. You know, that continent that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 300 years. Small detail. The kind of detail that makes archaeologists nervous and conspiracy theorists absolutely giddy. Let's break down exactly how impossible this is. In 1513, Europeans were still getting used to the idea that the Americas existed. Columbus had made his famous voyage just 21 years earlier. People were still arguing about whether these new lands were actually Asia or something entirely different. The printing press was barely 70 years old. This was not exactly the golden age of Antarctic exploration, mainly because nobody knew Antarctica existed. The continent wouldn't show up on official maps until 1820, when Russian and British expeditions independently spotted it and presumably thought, well, this is inconvenient for all our existing geography textbooks. But here's Piri Reis in 1513, casually drawing a detailed coastline of a place that shouldn't exist in anyone's knowledge base. And we're not talking about a vague blob with a note saying, "Here be ice dragons," or whatever medieval cartographers threw onto maps when they didn't know what they were dealing with. No, this map showed genuine geographical features, bays, inlets, the works. The kind of detail you get from actually surveying a coastline, not from wild speculation or lucky guessing. Now, you might be thinking, and this would be a perfectly reasonable thought, that maybe Piri Reis just imagined it. Maybe he was doodling during a boring meeting and accidentally drew something that happened to look like Antarctica. Artists do that sometimes, right? Paint something abstract that viewers later interpret as profound. Except here's where this stops being a happy coincidence and starts being a genuine problem for conventional history. When researchers in the 1960s used sonar to map the actual coastline of Antarctica beneath all that ice, they found something disturbing. The map was accurate, like shockingly accurate. The bays lined up, The coastline matched. It wasn't a rough approximation or a lucky guess. It was genuine cartographic data. Let me emphasize what this means, because it's the kind of thing that's easy to gloss over if you're not paying attention. The Piri-Reis map shows Antarctica's coastline as it exists under the ice. Not on top of the ice, under it. To create an accurate map of what's underneath miles of ice, you either need modern sonar technology, which didn't exist in 1513 and wouldn't exist for another 400 years, or you need to see the land when it wasn't covered in ice. Both options present problems for our understanding of history, though I'd argue the second option presents significantly larger problems. According to mainstream geology, and these are scientists who've spent their entire careers studying ice cores and sediment layers, so they're not just making this up. Antarctica has been frozen for approximately 34 million years. Give or take a few million, as scientists like to say when they're dealing with time frames that make your average history book look like a post-it note. 34 million years ago, humans didn't exist. Homo sapiens didn't exist. Our early ancestors were still figuring out how to walk upright without falling over. The concept of creating detailed navigational charts was roughly 33,999,000 years in the future. So we've got ourselves a proper historical paradox here. Either the Piri-Reis map is based on information from a time when Antarctica wasn't frozen, which would require time-traveling cartographers, or a civilization sophisticated enough to create detailed maps millions of years before humans supposedly evolved. Or Antarctica wasn't actually frozen as recently as, well, as recently as someone could create an accurate map of it. Both explanations make conventional historians extremely uncomfortable, which is always a good sign that we're on to something interesting. But wait, there's more, because this story gets even stranger. Piri-Reis himself admitted he didn't actually survey Antarctica personally. That would be quite the commute from the Ottoman Empire, and I'm pretty sure Turkish naval vessels weren't equipped for polar exploration in the early 1500s. Instead, he stated clearly in his notes that he compiled his map from older sources, maps that had been passed down, copied, and preserved from earlier civilizations. He specifically mentioned using about 20 different source maps, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, and others that were supposedly even older. Unfortunately, we can't verify this because those original source maps have conveniently disappeared into the mists of history, as important historical documents tend to do when you really want to study them. This raises an obvious question. Who exactly was sailing around Antarctica, mapping its coastline before it was covered in ice? And perhaps more importantly, what happened to them? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but there aren't any surviving civilizations from 34 million years ago. Not a lot of ancient libraries filled with pre-Ice Age cartographic data. No tourist shops selling "I mapped Antarctica before it was cool" souvenirs. Whoever these people were, they either disappeared completely or were never supposed to exist in the first place, according to our current timeline of human history. Now, some scholars have tried to explain this away by suggesting that maybe Antarctica wasn't frozen as recently as a few thousand years ago, rather than millions of years ago. This would be convenient because it would place the ice-free period within the realm of human civilization. There's even a geological theory, controversial but existing nonetheless, that suggests the Antarctic ice sheet might have been smaller or differently distributed during certain warming periods in relatively recent history. Maybe, these researchers suggest, there were parts of the coastline visible within the last 10,000 years or so. Problem solved, right? We can all go home, mystery debunked, nothing to see here. Except the mainstream geological evidence doesn't support this. Ice core samples, sediment analysis, all the sophisticated scientific tools we have for dating ancient climates, they all point to Antarctica being thoroughly frozen for an extremely long time. The kind of long time where recent means millions of years ago. And even if we granted that there was a brief warming period, that still doesn't explain how someone conducted such a thorough survey of the coastline, preserved that information, through whatever catastrophe ended their civilization, and passed it down through enough generations that it eventually reached Piri-Reis in 1513. You also have to consider the practical implications of creating such a map. This isn't like drawing a quick sketch of your neighborhood. Accurate coastal mapping requires systematic exploration, multiple observation points, understanding of latitude and longitude, and probably some kind of fleet of ships willing to sail into freezing waters for the sake of geography. It requires civilization-level organization. It requires resources. It requires a reason to care about mapping a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world. And it requires all of this to happen at a time when, according to our current understanding, the most advanced human technology was figuring out how to chip rocks into useful shapes. The kicker? The Piri-Reis map isn't even the only ancient map that shows mysterious knowledge of Antarctica. There's the Orientius-Finaeus map from 1531, which also depicts Antarctica, this time showing it as a separate continent with rivers and internal geographical features. The Buache map from 1737 shows Antarctica divided into two land masses by a waterway, which sounds wrong until you realize that modern surveys have confirmed there is indeed a body of water beneath the ice sheet that would split the continent if all. The ice melted. These aren't just random coincidences. These are multiple independent sources showing knowledge that shouldn't exist. It's like finding multiple people in the year 1200 with detailed diagrams of smartphones, complete with accurate depictions of circuit boards and touchscreens. You can't just shrug that off with lucky guess or interesting coincidence. At some point, you have to confront the possibility that someone, somewhere, somehow, had information they weren't supposed to have according to our current understanding of history. And here's where the official response to all this gets interesting. Rather than massive archaeological expeditions to figure out who mapped Antarctica and when, rather than serious academic conferences dedicated to solving this historical puzzle, we get silence. Well, not total silence. We get papers published in obscure journals suggesting the maps are forgeries, despite the fact that they're verified historical documents housed in museums. We get theories about how the mapmakers accidentally drew coastlines that happened to match reality. We get a lot of scholarly throat-clearing and subject-changing. What we don't get is serious institutional interest in answering what should be one of the most fascinating questions in archaeological history. This is where the modern story of Antarctic research starts to connect with these ancient mysteries. Because if someone did map Antarctica before it was frozen, that means there was sophisticated civilization operating on a time frame that completely contradicts our established historical narrative. And if that civilization existed and then disappeared, what happened to them? More importantly, what evidence of them might still be buried under those 2.5 miles of ice? These aren't idle questions. These are the kind of questions that, if answered, would require rewriting significant portions of what we think we know about human history and development. They're the kind of questions that make funding committees nervous and academic departments uncomfortable. They're also the kind of questions that might explain why, in 1959, a bunch of countries got together and decided that maybe Antarctica should have some very specific rules about who can research what and where. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get into the modern weirdness, the military operations, the strange discoveries, and the zones where even scientists aren't allowed to venture, we need to understand something fundamental. Antarctica isn't just hiding ice. It's hiding information. Information that someone, at some point, went to considerable effort to record. Information that somehow survived through catastrophic changes in climate and geography. Information that raises more questions than it answers. And if a map from 1513 can cause this much confusion and controversy, imagine what we might find if we actually looked under all that ice. Assuming, of course, that we're allowed to look. Which, as we're about to discover, is a much bigger if than you might expect. The frozen continent at the bottom of the world isn't just a geographic curiosity. It's a 5.5 million square mile question mark, wrapped in ice, tied up with international treaties, and apparently hiding information that dates back to a time when it shouldn't have been possible for anyone to record anything at all. Welcome to Antarctica, where the maps don't make sense, the timeline doesn't add up, and somehow, nobody in charge seems particularly interested in sorting any of it out. Which naturally makes the rest of us very interested indeed. Now that we've established that Antarctica has a habit of showing up in places it shouldn't, like on maps from 1513, let's talk about what's actually under all that ice. And I'm not referring to more ice, though there is plenty of that. I'm talking about lakes. Liquid water lakes. Hundreds of them, in fact, buried under miles of frozen wasteland, completely cut off from the outside world for time periods that make your family tree look like it was drawn yesterday. The star of this underground water show is Lake Vostok. And before you start picturing some quaint little pond where penguins go for a swim, let me paint you a more accurate picture. This thing is massive. We're talking about a body of water roughly the size of Lake Ontario. You know, one of the 5 Great Lakes, the kind that shows up on maps and has its own weather systems. Except Lake Vostok is buried under more than 2 miles of solid ice. 2 miles. That's deeper than the deepest part of the Grand Canyon. If you drilled straight down through that ice, you'd have time to reconsider your life choices, write a novel, and possibly learn a new language before you hit water. The Russians discovered this subglacial lake back in the 1970s using seismic surveys, which is basically bouncing sound waves off things and seeing what bounces back. What bounced back was unexpected, to put it mildly. A vast body of liquid water that had been sealed off from the surface for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years, depending on which geologist you ask. To put that in perspective, when this lake was last exposed to sunlight, the most advanced life forms on Earth were probably having heated debates about whether walking upright was worth the back pain. Now you might be wondering how water stays liquid under 2 miles of ice in Antarctica, where the surface temperature makes a walk-in freezer look like a beach vacation. The answer is actually pretty straightforward: pressure and geothermal heat. The sheer weight of all that ice above creates pressure that lowers the freezing point of water, and heat from Earth's interior keeps things from turning into a giant ice cube. It's basic physics, which is reassuring because it means we don't have to invoke ancient alien heating systems. Yet. The exciting part about Lake Vostok isn't just that it exists, it's what might be living in it. An ecosystem that's been completely isolated from the rest of Earth's biosphere for millions of years is essentially a natural laboratory for evolution. Whatever bacteria, microorganisms, or potentially larger life forms are down there have been developing independently for longer than humans have existed. It's like opening a time capsule, except instead of photos and newspapers from 50 years ago, you're potentially finding life forms that evolved in a completely sealed environment since before most modern species existed. No pressure for the researchers involved. So naturally, the Russians decided to drill down to it. Because when you find a pristine, isolated ecosystem that's been sealed off for millions of years, the logical next step is to poke a hole in it and see what happens. The drilling project began in earnest in the 1990s and continued for years, slowly boring through mile after mile of ancient ice. This wasn't exactly a quick operation. They were drilling through ice that had been accumulating for millennia, taking core samples as they went, moving at a pace that would make glacial movement look speedy. In February 2012, they finally broke through. After decades of drilling, millions in funding, and who knows how many frozen fingers, the Russian team reached the surface of Lake Vostok. They'd made it. They'd accessed a sealed ecosystem older than human civilization, older than most species currently walking around on Earth. This was huge. This was the kind of scientific achievement that should have resulted in papers, conferences, documentary films, and probably at least a few Nobel Prize nominations. Instead, we got silence. Well, not complete silence. There was a brief announcement that they'd successfully penetrated the ice and accessed the lake. And then, nothing. No results. No published findings. No, here's what we found in this ancient sealed ecosystem press conferences. The Russian research station continued operating. Researchers came and went, but information about what they actually discovered in Lake Vostok became remarkably difficult to find. It's like drilling into a buried treasure vault, announcing you've opened it, and then refusing to discuss whether there was anything inside. Naturally, this approach was fantastic for public confidence and totally didn't make anyone suspicious at all. Now, before we dive into speculation about what might have caused this sudden case of scientific shyness, let's talk about the other weird thing involving Lake Vostok: the magnetic anomalies. Satellites scanning Antarctica have detected unusual magnetic readings over the lake, the kind that make geologists tilt their heads like confused dogs. These aren't your standard magnetic variations you'd expect from geological formations. They're stronger, more focused, and positioned in ways that don't match up with what should be causing them, based on our understanding of the rock formations underneath. Magnetic anomalies can be caused by various things: concentrations of metallic minerals, unusual rock formations, volcanic activity. But the anomalies over Lake Vostok don't fit neatly into any of those categories. They're too strong, too localized, and too consistent. Some researchers have suggested they might be caused by something large and metallic buried in the sediment at the bottom of the lake, which could be a natural geological formation, absolutely. Or it could be something that wasn't created by geological processes at all. Both explanations are possible, but only one of them keeps scientists up at night. Here's where I have to address the obvious speculation that pops up whenever you mention buried lakes and magnetic anomalies in the same sentence. The idea that there might be ancient structures down there. Ruins from a pre-Ice Age civilization, possibly with technology we don't fully understand, sitting at the bottom of a sealed lake under 2 miles of ice. It sounds like the plot of a science fiction movie. The kind where the scientists definitely shouldn't open the sealed chamber but do it anyway because the script requires it. But here's the thing. If you wanted to preserve something for millions of years, sealing it under a giant lake buried under miles of ice isn't a terrible strategy. It's climate-controlled, isolated from surface contamination, and protected from the various catastrophes that tend to destroy things left on the surface. Of course, the more mundane explanation is that the Russian research team found exactly what you'd expect: ancient microbes, some interesting chemistry, and nothing that required immediate classification. Maybe the silence is just bureaucratic red tape, funding issues, or scientific caution about publishing results until they're absolutely certain. These are all perfectly reasonable explanations that don't require any conspiracy theories or ancient civilizations. They're also explanations that would be a lot more convincing if there was literally any public data about what they found. But Lake Vostok isn't the only reason Antarctica makes the list of places that are weirdly secretive. We need to talk about Operation High Jump, because this is where things transition from geologically interesting to why exactly did the military get involved? In late 1946, just after World War II ended and everyone was presumably tired of military operations, the United States decided that what Antarctica really needed was a major naval expedition. Not a small research mission, not a couple of scientists with notebooks. A full-scale military operation involving thousands of personnel, over a dozen ships, and enough aircraft to suggest they were planning for something more intense than Penguin. Photography. The operation was led by Admiral Richard Byrd, who was already famous for Antarctic exploration. This wasn't his first trip down south. The official story was straightforward: map the coastline, establish research stations, test equipment in extreme conditions, basically all the things you'd expect from a polar expedition. The projected timeline was 6 to 8 months, which seemed reasonable given the scale of the operation and the amount of territory they planned to cover. Everything seemed routine, at least on paper, except the expedition was suddenly terminated after only 8 weeks. Not 6 months, not 8 months, 8 weeks. They packed up, turned around, and headed home with considerably less fanfare than when they'd arrived. The ships that returned showed damage that was officially attributed to difficult ice conditions, which is certainly plausible given that they were operating in Antarctica, where ice is somewhat common. But the level of damage seemed excessive for routine ice encounters, especially for a military expedition that had presumably planned for dealing with ice. Then there are Admiral Byrd's statements after the operation, which have been the subject of debate and interpretation for decades. He allegedly spoke about encountering hostile elements and mentioned something about needing to be prepared for threats that could move from pole to pole with incredible speed. Now, these quotes are somewhat disputed, some researchers claim. They're taken out of context or misreported, while others insist they're accurately representing what Byrd said in interviews and personal journals. Either way, it's interesting phrasing for someone who was supposedly just mapping coastlines and taking ice samples. Here's what we know for certain. Operation High Jump was a massive military operation that was cut short for reasons that weren't fully explained publicly. The expedition encountered something, whether it was difficult ice conditions, equipment failures, or something else, that caused them to abort the mission and return early. And whatever that something was, it was significant enough to damage multiple ships and convince the military leadership that continuing wasn't worth it. For a military operation that had been months in planning and involved thousands of personnel, that's not a minor decision. Now, the speculation around Operation High Jump ranges from the mundane to the absolutely wild. Some suggest they were actually hunting for Nazi submarine bases, which isn't as crazy as it sounds given that German U-boats had operated in the South Atlantic during the war. Others propose they encountered unusual weather phenomena or geological hazards that made continuing dangerous. And then there are the theories that they found something under the ice, ancient structures, technology, or other discoveries that required immediate classification. Take your pick, but remember that only one of these options explains why certain parts of Antarctica are still off limits to researchers 75 years later. Speaking of things being off limits, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the elephant on the ice sheet. Antarctica has zones where even scientific research is restricted, not just difficult to access because of terrain or weather, but actively prohibited by international agreement. These aren't just areas where you need special permits or extra safety equipment. They're zones where you simply cannot go, period. Even if you're a credentialed researcher with legitimate scientific objectives. The official explanations usually involve environmental protection or safety concerns, which sound perfectly reasonable, until you notice that some of these restricted zones are in the middle of nowhere, far from any fragile ecosystems or obvious hazards. Military aircraft still fly over Antarctica with surprising regularity, considering it's supposedly a demilitarized continent devoted to peaceful scientific research. Multiple nations operate permanent bases there, and while they're officially research stations, some of them have capabilities that seem excessive for studying ice cores and tracking penguin populations. The United States maintains McMurdo Station, which is less of a research outpost and more of a small town, complete with infrastructure that could support operations well beyond basic scientific research. Russia, China, and several other nations maintain similarly substantial facilities. The pattern that emerges from all of this, the maps that shouldn't exist, the buried lakes with magnetic anomalies, the military operations that were cut short, the ongoing restrictions on access, suggests that Antarctica is more than just a frozen continent at the bottom of the world. It's a place where the official story and the reality on the ground might not completely align. Whether that's because of ancient civilizations, natural phenomena we don't fully understand, or something else entirely, the end result is the same. Antarctica keeps its secrets remarkably well. And before anyone accuses me of going full conspiracy theorist here, consider this. The simplest explanation for all the secrecy and restriction around certain Antarctic locations would be that there's nothing particularly interesting there, and it's all just bureaucratic caution. But if that's the case, why not just open it up? Why maintain strict controls on access to areas that are supposedly just more ice and rock? Why classify research results from a lake that's been sealed for millions of years? The secrecy itself is what creates the mystery, and the mystery is what makes people ask questions. Lake Vostok remains sealed under its miles of ice, potentially harboring life forms that have evolved in isolation for longer than most species have existed on Earth. The results of the Russian drilling expedition remain classified or unreleased, depending on who you ask. Operation High Jump remains a historical footnote with more questions than answers. And Antarctica continues to be a place where international agreements prohibit access to certain zones for reasons that are never quite fully explained. But we're not done with Antarctica's mysteries yet, because buried lakes and aborted military operations are just the beginning. There are magnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist, thermal readings that don't make sense, and geometric patterns visible from space that suggest something very interesting might be lurking under all that ice. And that's before we even get into the treaties and agreements that govern what can and cannot be researched on this continent. The frozen continent at the bottom of the world isn't just keeping secrets, it's actively guarding them. And the more you look at what's known about Antarctica, the more you realize how much is deliberately unknown. Which naturally raises the question, what exactly are we not supposed to find down there? If you thought Antarctica was just a uniform block of ice where everything is frozen solid and nothing interesting happens beneath the surface, well, satellite data would like to have a word with you. Because it turns out that under all that ice, there are zones where the temperature is downright comfortable. We're talking 70 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of temperature where you could theoretically walk around in shorts and a t-shirt if you weren't, buried under 2 miles of solid ice. Which raises an obvious question. Why exactly are there tropical vacation temperatures under the most frozen place on Earth? The official explanation is geothermal activity, which makes perfect sense. Earth's interior is hot. Heat rises. Sometimes you get warm spots. Perfectly normal geological process. Nothing to see here. Except there's a small problem with this explanation. The warm spots don't line up with where the warm spots should be. Antarctica does have volcanoes and areas of genuine volcanic activity. And yes, those areas are warm. That's expected. What's not expected is finding significant heat sources in areas where there's no volcanic activity, no obvious geological explanation, and no reason for the ground to be generating enough heat to melt ice from below. Let me be more specific about what satellites have detected, because warm spots doesn't quite capture the scale of what we're dealing with. These aren't small pockets of slightly less cold ice. These are extensive zones where the ice is melting from the bottom up, creating massive subglacial cavities, hollow spaces large enough to fit entire buildings, or in some cases, entire city blocks. The meltwater flows through these spaces, carving out tunnels and chambers in patterns that would make a spelunker extremely jealous if they could actually access them. Which they can't, obviously, because international agreements and also the whole buried under miles of ice situation. Now, geothermal heat creating subglacial lakes and cavities is a known phenomenon. It happens. Science has documented it. But the interesting part is where some of these thermal anomalies are located and how they're distributed. When you map out the heat sources, they don't follow the random patterns you'd expect from natural geological activity. Instead, they form geometric arrangements, lines, grids, patterns that look suspiciously organized for something that's supposedly being caused by random magma flows and volcanic processes. Infrared satellite imaging has picked up these patterns from space, and they're odd enough that multiple research teams have noted them in published papers. Not odd enough to spark widespread academic panic, mind you, but odd enough that you get statements like, "The distribution of thermal anomalies does not correspond with known geological formations," and "Further research is needed to determine the source of these heat signatures," which is academic speak for, "We have no idea what's causing this, but we're not ready to say that out loud yet." Here's where it gets even more interesting. Some of these warm zones are creating ecosystems, actual living ecosystems in subglacial cavities, with temperatures warm enough to support life, liquid water, and probably bacteria having the time of their lives in their sealed-off underground paradise. These aren't like Lake Vostok, which is sealed and isolated. These are active systems with water circulation, heat flow, and conditions that could theoretically support much more complex life than simple microorganisms. Not exactly the kind of environment you'd expect to find under Antarctica, but there it is, confirmed by multiple independent satellite surveys and the occasional research expedition that gets permission to study the edges of these zones. The problem, and there's always a problem, is that accessing these areas for detailed study is remarkably difficult. Not just because of the technical challenges of drilling through miles of ice, though that's certainly a factor, but also because some of these thermal anomaly zones happen to overlap with areas that are restricted for research. Zones where international agreements prohibit detailed investigation, ostensibly for environmental protection reasons, which is a perfectly valid concern if you're worried about contaminating pristine ecosystems. But it does make it awfully convenient that we can't get detailed data on these geometrically arranged heat sources that don't match up with any known geological activity. But thermal anomalies are just one flavor of Antarctic weirdness. Let's talk about magnetism, because Antarctica has a relationship with magnetic fields that can best be described as complicated and occasionally hostile. Compasses don't work properly in Antarctica. This is known. This is expected. Magnetic South Pole is down there. Magnetic fields get wonky near the poles. Navigation gets tricky. Standard polar exploration problems that people have been dealing with since the days when explorers wore wool and hoped for the best. Except what's happening in certain parts of Antarctica goes way beyond standard magnetic pole interference. We're talking about magnetic anomalies so strong that they overwhelm navigation equipment, cause instruments to give readings that make no physical sense, and generally make pilots very nervous when they have to fly over these areas. Commercial aircraft routes avoid certain Antarctic regions, not just because of weather or distance, but because the magnetic interference is severe enough to affect electronic systems. Your in-flight entertainment cutting out is annoying. Your navigation systems having a complete meltdown while you're flying over the most remote continent on Earth is considerably more problematic. The Gamburtsev Mountains, which are themselves kind of weird because they're a mountain range buried under ice that nobody even knew existed until relatively recently, are home to some of the strongest magnetic anomalies ever recorded on Earth. We're talking about magnetic readings that are 15 times stronger than Earth's normal magnetic background. 15 times. That's not a minor variation. That's not a small anomaly. That's the kind of reading that makes geologists check their equipment 3 times to make sure it's not malfunctioning. Here's the really strange part. The source of this magnetic anomaly isn't in the Earth's crust where you'd expect it to be. It's deeper. Much deeper. The readings suggest the source is somewhere between 3 and 4 miles underground, which is odd because magnetic anomalies are usually caused by mineral deposits or rock formations in the crust, not by things buried in the deeper layers of Earth's structure. There are geological explanations for this. Unusual concentrations of metallic minerals, specific rock formations with high iron content, volcanic features that formed in weird ways. All possible, all plausible, all perfectly reasonable explanations that would be much more convincing if we could actually go and investigate these areas directly. But we can't. Because, once again, international agreements restrict access to certain zones for research purposes. The areas with the strongest magnetic anomalies happen to be in regions where ground-based investigation is prohibited. You can fly over them and get readings from aircraft. You can use satellites to detect the anomalies from space. What you cannot do is go there, drill some holes, set up ground-penetrating radar, and actually figure out what's causing these readings. Which is frustrating if you're a scientist who wants to understand unusual geological phenomena, and suspicious if you're literally anyone else paying attention to the pattern of restrictions. Pilots who've flown over certain Antarctic regions report some genuinely unsettling experiences. Complete electronic failure, navigation systems going dark, instruments giving contradictory readings or no readings at all. This happens for minutes at a time, not just a brief flicker or a momentary glitch, but sustained periods where the aircraft's electronic systems are essentially offline. Now, these planes don't crash. Pilots manage to navigate through it, and systems come back online once they're clear of the area. But it's the kind of thing that gets reported and documented because when you're flying over Antarctica and all your electronics stop working, that's not something you forget to mention in your flight log. The standard explanation is magnetic interference from natural geological formations, which is absolutely a thing that happens. Certain rock formations can create magnetic fields strong enough to affect instruments. But the scale and consistency of what's being reported from Antarctica goes beyond what you'd expect from natural interference. These aren't random fluctuations or occasional anomalies. These are specific zones where electronic systems reliably fail, where magnetic readings are consistently and dramatically abnormal, and where the effects are strong enough to be detected and mapped from space. Scientists who study Earth's magnetic field for a living will tell you that Antarctica is full of fascinating magnetic phenomena that we don't fully understand. They'll also tell you that understanding these phenomena would require detailed ground-based studies, comprehensive surveys, and direct investigation of the areas with the strongest anomalies. And then they'll tell you that such investigations aren't currently possible due to international restrictions, funding limitations, and various other logistical and political challenges. It's the kind of situation where everyone agrees the phenomena are interesting, but nobody's able to actually study them in the detail necessary to explain them. Let's connect some dots here, because we've now covered ancient maps showing impossible geographical knowledge, buried lakes with magnetic anomalies and classified research results, aborted military operations with mysterious damage, thermal zones that don't match geological predictions, and magnetic anomalies strong enough to disable aircraft electronics. Individually, each of these things has a reasonable conventional explanation. Ancient maps? Probably copies of older maps with some lucky guesses. Buried lakes? Natural phenomenon with boring scientific explanations. Military operations cut short? Bad planning or unexpected weather? Thermal anomalies? Geothermal activity that happens to be distributed strangely. Magnetic weirdness? Unusual geological formations that we can't study because of access restrictions. But when you line them all up together, the pattern starts to look less like a series of unrelated phenomena and more like symptoms of something larger that we're not getting the full story about. And before anyone accuses me of connecting dots that shouldn't be connected, remember that the most suspicious thing about all of this isn't the phenomena themselves. It's the consistent pattern of restrictions, classifications, and barriers too. Research that prevent detailed investigation of the most interesting areas. If these were just natural geological features creating interesting readings, why restrict access? If the thermal anomalies are just geothermal heat with unusual distribution, why not study them in detail to understand the geological processes? If the magnetic anomalies are just mineral deposits or rock formations, why prohibit ground-based research? The official answers involve environmental protection, safety concerns, and logistical challenges, which are all valid considerations for research in Antarctica, absolutely. But they're also conveniently applicable to prevent detailed investigation of areas that might reveal something other than standard geology. Consider the practical implications of what we know. There are zones under the Antarctic ice where the temperature is comfortable enough for humans. There are massive subglacial cavities created by this heat, large enough to potentially contain structures or ecosystems, or whatever else might have ended up down there. There are magnetic anomalies that suggest large metallic objects or structures at depths where they shouldn't naturally occur. There are geometric patterns in the distribution of heat sources that look suspiciously organized. And there are international agreements that have remained in force for decades, restricting access to the areas where all of these phenomena are strongest. The thermal anomalies alone are fascinating from a geological standpoint. Ice melting from below, creating hollow spaces, forming ecosystems in complete darkness. That's incredible science that deserves serious study. The magnetic anomalies are equally interesting. Understanding what's causing readings 15 times stronger than normal could teach us things about Earth's magnetic field that we don't currently know. These are legitimate scientific mysteries that, in any other location on Earth, would be the subject of intensive research efforts, multiple expeditions, and probably competing teams racing to publish their findings first. But in Antarctica, we get satellite data, restricted access, and a whole lot of, "This is interesting, but we can't investigate it further." Which might be entirely reasonable and justified, or it might be the kind of thing that makes you wonder, what exactly would be found if someone did manage to drill down to those heat sources, or investigate those magnetic anomalies up close. Unfortunately, we're not likely to find out anytime soon, because the current international framework around Antarctic research seems designed specifically to prevent that kind of detailed investigation in the most interesting areas. So we're left with a continent that has impossible ancient maps, buried lakes with classified research results, aborted military operations, thermal zones creating geometric patterns, and magnetic anomalies that disable aircraft electronics. All perfectly explainable through conventional science, of course, assuming you're willing to accept a remarkable string of coincidences and don't mind that we're not allowed to verify any of these explanations through direct investigation of them. Areas in question. Antarctica keeps getting stranger the more you look at it, and the more barriers there are to looking at it closely, the more interesting the questions become. What exactly is generating enough heat to create tropical temperatures under miles of ice? What's causing magnetic anomalies strong enough to overwhelm modern navigation systems? And why are the areas with the most dramatic anomalies also the areas where research is most restricted? These are straightforward questions that deserve straightforward answers. The fact that we're not getting them is perhaps the most interesting data point of all. But we're not done with Antarctica yet, because on top of the geological mysteries and magnetic chaos, there's a whole layer of international politics and agreements that govern who can do what on this continent. And when you look at who signed those agreements and what they actually say, things get even more interesting. But that's a story for the next part of this frozen puzzle. So we've established that Antarctica has some genuinely weird stuff going on. Maps from centuries ago showing coastlines that shouldn't be mapped, buried lakes with classified research, thermal zones creating geometric patterns, and magnetic anomalies that make aircraft electronics have existential crises. Now we need to talk about how the international community decided to handle all of this weirdness. Which brings us to 1959, and what might be the most unanimously agreed upon treaty in modern history. And if you know anything about international politics, you'll understand why that fact alone should make you suspicious. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959 by 12 original countries and eventually grew to include 54 signatory nations. That's 54 countries, including some that can't agree on literally anything else, all signing the same document and actually following it for over 6 decades. For context, getting 54 countries to agree on pizza toppings would be challenging. Getting them to agree on territorial rights, military restrictions, and research protocols for an entire continent? That's the kind of diplomatic miracle that happens approximately never, unless there's a really compelling reason for everyone to play nice. The official purpose of the Antarctic Treaty is straightforward and sounds entirely reasonable. Antarctica would be reserved for peaceful purposes and scientific research only. No military activity, no weapons testing, no territorial claims that could lead to conflicts. All very civilized, all very sensible, especially coming out of a period where the world had just finished one major war and was settling into the Cold War with all its associated tension. Turning Antarctica into a demilitarized zone for science sounds like exactly the kind of enlightened international cooperation we'd want to see more of. And yet, there's always an "and yet" with Antarctica. Because while the public-facing parts of the Antarctic Treaty are all about peaceful research and environmental protection, there are provisions in the treaty that are notably less publicized. Classified annexes that have been only partially declassified. Language about protecting objects of special significance and managing information of archaeological nature, which is interesting phrasing for a continent that officially has no archaeology because nobody lived there until modern research. Stations were established. You don't typically need protocols for managing archaeological information on a place where there's supposedly no archaeology to manage. Let's consider the timing here, because 1959 is a fascinating year to suddenly get 54 countries to agree on anything. The Cold War was in full swing. The Soviet Union and the United States were competing on every front imaginable. Space, military technology, ideological influence, who could build the scariest nuclear arsenal? These were not nations that were in the habit of cooperating on much of anything. The idea that they would sit down together and unanimously agree to restrictions on Antarctic activity seems almost quaint if you remember that this is the same period where they were having showdowns over Berlin and racing to put satellites into orbit. But Antarctica? That got unanimous agreement, with apparently minimal negotiation and no public debate. The treaty was proposed, discussed behind closed doors, signed by all parties and implemented. No major news coverage, no public controversy, no years of negotiations with holdouts demanding concessions. Just a remarkably smooth process that resulted in one of the most enduring and universally respected international agreements in history. Either this was a stunning display of diplomatic competence that has never been replicated since, or there was a very good reason why everyone wanted this treaty in place and nobody wanted to argue about it publicly. The treaty includes some specific restrictions that are worth noting. Military personnel can visit Antarctica for support of scientific operations, but military bases are prohibited. Weapons testing is banned. Nuclear explosions are forbidden. All pretty standard stuff if you're trying to keep a continent peaceful and avoid it becoming another front in international conflicts. But there's also language about sharing scientific findings and making research transparent, which sounds great in theory but has some interesting practical limitations. Research has to be shared, unless it falls under certain protected categories. Information has to be disclosed, unless there are security or environmental reasons not to. These are the kinds of loopholes that sound reasonable but create plenty of space for, we found something but we're not going to tell you about it situations. The treaty also establishes zones where access is restricted. Some of this is legitimate environmental protection. You don't want hordes of tourists trampling fragile ecosystems or disturbing wildlife. But some of the restricted zones are in areas with no obvious environmental justification. Remote regions far from any penguin colonies or seal populations. Interior sections of the continent where the only thing you'd be disturbing is ice and more ice. Yet these areas are off-limits even to credentialed scientific research teams, often with explanations that boil down to, because the treaty says so. Here's where the classified annexes become relevant, because apparently the public treaty isn't the whole story. Portions of the original agreement remain classified, which is an interesting choice for a treaty that's supposedly about transparent scientific cooperation. The partially declassified sections include references to protocols for discoveries of unusual significance and procedures for managing sensitive information of historical importance, which again raises the question, what exactly were they expecting to find on a continent that officially has no human history prior to the modern era? Think about what had happened in Antarctica in the years leading up to 1959. Operation High Jump in 1946 to 47 had been abruptly terminated. Multiple nations had started establishing permanent research bases. Exploration was accelerating, mapping was becoming more sophisticated, and planes were flying over regions that had never been surveyed before. And then, right around the time when serious systematic exploration was becoming feasible with post-war technology, everyone agrees to sign a treaty with classified provisions about managing archaeological information and protecting objects of special significance. The timing is either remarkable coincidence or it's not coincidence at all. The other fascinating aspect of the treaty is how seriously everyone takes it. International agreements get violated all the time. Countries push boundaries, test limits, interpret provisions in creative ways to suit their interests. But the Antarctic Treaty? That gets respected. Monitored by multiple nations, with regular inspection provisions to ensure compliance. Nations that can barely cooperate on climate agreements or arms control somehow manage to maintain strict adherence to Antarctic protocols for over 60 years. It's either a testament to humanity's ability to cooperate when we put our minds to it, or it's a sign that there's something down there important enough that nobody wants to risk unrestricted access. Now, let's talk about what might have motivated this impressive display of international unity. Because this is where we transition from treaties and politics to actual physical objects that shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of history. Over the decades of Antarctic research, various expeditions have reported finding things that don't fit. Objects that appear manufactured, structures with geometric precision, and artifacts that pose serious problems for the established timeline of human technological development. In 1939, conveniently right before World War II dominated everyone's attention, a Norwegian expedition reported discovering large stone formations with carved surfaces in a remote Antarctic region. The formations reportedly resembled statuary, with shapes that suggested deliberate human or humanoid craftsmanship. This information was documented in expedition logs, but was never widely published or verified by follow-up expeditions. The areas where these formations were supposedly found became, probably coincidentally, some of the regions later designated as restricted access zones under the Antarctic Treaty. The original expedition members were presumably busy with other things during the war years, and by the time anyone thought to follow up, access to those areas was no longer permitted. What makes these reports interesting, beyond the obvious, wait, sculptures in Antarctica factor, is that they're not isolated incidents. Multiple expeditions over multiple decades have reported similar findings. Stone structures with too perfect geometry. Surface features that look machined rather than naturally eroded. Formations that appear deliberately placed rather than randomly distributed by geological processes. None of these reports get mainstream academic attention, partly because they're hard to verify. The objects are buried under ice, located in restricted zones, or both, and partly because they challenge fundamental assumptions about where and when human civilization developed. Let me be clear about what we're dealing with here, because ancient artifacts in Antarctica sounds like the kind of thing you'd find in the bargain bin of alternative history theories, right next to books about ancient aliens building pyramids. But the reports aren't coming from random enthusiasts with metal detectors and overactive imaginations. These are professional expeditions, credentialed researchers, people who know the difference between interesting rock formations and genuine anomalies. When multiple independent sources report similar findings in similar circumstances, at some point you have to consider that maybe there's something there worth investigating properly, which would require access to the areas in question, which is prohibited. See how convenient that works out? In 2001, a research team working near the Beardmore Glacier, that's one of the major glaciers in Antarctica for those keeping track, used ground-penetrating radar to survey the area and detected a large object buried in the ice. Not a rock formation, not a natural geological feature, but something that gave radar returns consistent with a manufactured metal object. The thing was reportedly cylindrical, approximately 400 feet long, and made from materials that didn't match known alloys when they managed to get a small sample from the edge. This is the kind of discovery that should have resulted in immediate follow-up expeditions, extensive media coverage, and probably several competing documentary crews racing to be first on site. Instead, the samples were confiscated, the photographs were classified, and the research team was told that further investigation of that specific site was not permitted for environmental protection reasons. Because apparently, there's a very fragile ecosystem 400 feet under solid ice that would be devastated by researchers studying a metallic cylindrical object that shouldn't exist in the first place. The team members who were involved in the discovery signed non-disclosure agreements. Their findings were never published in academic journals, and the site became another addition to the long list of areas where research is mysteriously restricted. Now, I want to be careful here, because we're venturing into territory where it's easy to let speculation run wild, and hard evidence becomes frustratingly scarce. The problem with secret findings in classified research is that by definition, we don't have access to the data. We have reports from researchers, some documentation that leaked or was partially declassified, and a lot of holes where information should be. It's entirely possible that all of these objects have perfectly mundane explanations: unusual rock formations, misinterpreted radar data, natural metal deposits that confused researchers. It's also possible that there are legitimate security or environmental reasons for restricting access and classifying findings. But here's what we can say with certainty. There is a pattern. Reports of unusual objects and structures appear consistently across different time periods, different expeditions, different research teams. These reports are taken seriously enough that access to the relevant areas is restricted and findings are classified. The restrictions persist for decades, well beyond what you'd expect for temporary environmental concerns or short-term security considerations. And all of this is happening within a framework established by an international treaty that includes provisions for managing archaeological information on a continent that supposedly has no archaeology. The Antarctic Treaty has been remarkably effective at maintaining peace and scientific cooperation on the continent. It's also been remarkably effective at maintaining control over what gets researched, what gets published, and who gets access to which areas. Whether these two facts are related or just coincidental depends largely on how much you trust that international agreements with classified provisions are always operating in the public interest with complete transparency about their reasoning. Consider what happens if you're a researcher who wants to investigate one of these anomalies. First, you need to get funding, which is challenging when you're proposing to research something controversial. Then you need permits, which require approval from multiple international bodies, who all take the Antarctic Treaty very seriously. Then you need to propose specific research sites. And if those sites happen to be in restricted zones, you need to explain why your research is important enough to justify access. And if your research proposal involves investigating potential archaeological artifacts on a continent that officially has no archaeology, you're going to face some very pointed questions about your scientific credibility and methodology. This creates a situation where the most interesting questions are the hardest ones to research, and the researchers most likely to find unexpected answers are the ones least likely to get approval or funding. It's not an outright prohibition on investigation, that would be too obvious. It's just a system of bureaucratic and practical obstacles that makes certain types of research effectively impossible while maintaining the appearance of scientific openness. The result is that Antarctica remains mysterious. We have tantalizing hints of anomalies, maps, buried objects, unusual structures, findings that get classified. But we don't have the comprehensive investigation that would be needed to actually answer the questions these hints raise. And the system is set up, whether intentionally or not, to keep things that way. The Antarctic Treaty ensures that no single nation can unilaterally decide to conduct unrestricted research in sensitive areas. The classified provisions mean that even if something is found, there are established protocols for keeping it quiet. The restricted zones mean that the most interesting areas are the ones where investigation is prohibited. If you wanted to design a system to maintain control over information about a continent, while appearing to promote scientific research and international cooperation, you could hardly do better than the current Antarctic framework, which might be exactly what's needed to protect sensitive environmental areas and prevent conflicts over territorial claims. Or it might be a way to ensure that certain discoveries remain under wraps, and certain questions don't get definitively answered. The treaty itself doesn't tell us which interpretation is correct, but the fact that it works so well, has lasted so long, and is followed so consistently by nations that can barely agree on anything else, is certainly interesting. We're left with a continent governed by unprecedented international cooperation, protected by treaties with classified provisions, dotted with restricted zones, and home to reported discoveries that challenge conventional history, but can't be properly investigated. Maps that show too much, lakes with classified research, military operations that ended mysteriously, thermal and magnetic anomalies that defy easy explanation, and now a treaty system that seems designed to prevent us from getting clear answers to any of these mysteries. Antarctica isn't just the most remote continent, it's the most controlled one. And the question remains, what exactly is being protected down there? And why does everyone in power seem so determined to keep it that way? At this point, you might be thinking that Antarctica is just one isolated frozen mystery at the bottom of the world, completely separate from the rest of human history and civilization. And you'd be wrong. Because apparently, Antarctica might be connected to some of the most famous ancient sites on Earth in ways that make conventional archaeology extremely uncomfortable. We're talking about mathematical relationships, geometric patterns, and similarities in construction techniques that span continents and oceans. Either this is the mother of all coincidences, or something very interesting was happening in the ancient world that our history books haven't quite caught up with yet. Let's start with a simple exercise that's going to make you look at world maps differently from now on. Take the Great Pyramid at Giza, that massive stone structure in Egypt that people love to argue about, and draw a line to Stonehenge in England. Now draw another line from the pyramid to Easter Island in the Pacific. Add in lines to Machu Picchu in Peru, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and a few other ancient sites that give archaeologists headaches because nobody can fully explain how they were built. Now, if you extend some of these lines and add in the reported structural anomalies in Antarctica, something weird happens. The lines form geometric patterns. Not random patterns, not approximate patterns, precise geometric relationships based on ratios that show up in nature and mathematics. We're talking about the golden ratio, that mathematical constant that appears in everything from nautilus shells to galaxy spirals, and apparently also in the global distribution of ancient megalithic sites. When you plot these locations and measure the distances and angles between them, you get relationships that are mathematically significant, which could be total coincidence. After all, if you draw enough lines between enough points on a sphere, you're bound to find some patterns. Except the patterns we're seeing aren't the result of cherry-picking random sites. These are specifically the sites that are famous for being massive, ancient, and built with techniques that challenge our understanding of ancient capabilities. Think about what these sites have in common. They all involve moving and placing stones that weigh hundreds of tons, sometimes thousands of tons, with a precision that modern engineers find impressive even with contemporary equipment. They're all oriented to astronomical phenomena with accuracy that requires sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Many of them feature similar architectural elements, despite being separated by oceans and having supposedly no contact with each other according to mainstream historical timelines. And many of them have symbols and motifs that appear similar enough to make you wonder if maybe these ancient cultures were reading from the same instruction manual. The Great Pyramid at Giza is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of a degree, which is remarkable considering it was supposedly built with copper tools and wooden rollers. Stonehenge tracks solstices and equinoxes with precision that required generations of careful astronomical observation. Machu Picchu has stones cut and fitted so precisely that you can't fit a piece of paper between them, and some of these stones weigh over 50 tons and were somehow transported up a mountain. Easter Island has those famous statues, hundreds of them, some weighing over 80 tons, carved and moved across the island using methods that archaeologists are still debating. Now, individually, each of these sites can be explained within the framework of what we know about ancient civilizations. Given enough time, manpower, and motivation, humans can accomplish remarkable things even with primitive technology. The pyramids were built over decades by thousands of workers. Stonehenge was constructed in phases over centuries. Machu Picchu represents the pinnacle of Inca engineering. All perfectly reasonable explanations that don't require any assumptions about lost advanced civilizations or ancient high technology. But here's where it gets interesting. When you map these sites and look at their relationships to each other and to Antarctica, the geometric patterns suggest something more than random distribution. The distances between sites form ratios. The angles align with specific mathematical constants. And Antarctica, if you include it in these calculations, using the locations of reported structural anomalies detected by various surveys, sits at what appears to be a central node in this geometric network. It's positioned in such a way that lines connecting it to other sites create angles and proportions that are mathematically significant rather than arbitrary. Now, before we go full ancient aliens with this, let's talk about what could explain these patterns without invoking lost civilizations or pre-Ice Age Antarctic cities. One possibility is that humans have always been drawn to certain geometric relationships because they appear in nature and are aesthetically pleasing. The golden ratio shows up in art, architecture, and design across cultures because it's fundamentally satisfying to the human eye and mind. Maybe ancient builders independently developed similar techniques and preferences because they were all working with the same basic mathematical and aesthetic principles. The global patterns we see could be the result of universal human tendencies rather than shared knowledge or coordinated planning. Another explanation is confirmation bias. We're finding patterns because we're looking for them, and if we searched hard enough, we could find geometric relationships between any arbitrary set of points on the globe. Draw enough lines, measure enough angles, calculate enough ratios, and eventually you'll find something that looks significant, even if it's just statistical noise. This is a valid criticism, and one that serious researchers in this field have to contend with. Not every line on a map means something, and not every numerical relationship is evidence of ancient knowledge. But, and this is a significant but, the patterns become harder to dismiss when you add in the technological similarities. We're not just talking about sites that form geometric relationships on a map. We're talking about sites that were all built using techniques that seem too advanced for their supposed time periods, that all required moving massive stones with precision we struggle to replicate, that all demonstrate astronomical knowledge that, supposedly, didn't exist yet. The technological parallels between these sites are well documented and acknowledged even by mainstream archaeologists, even if there's disagreement about what those parallels mean. Consider the stone-cutting techniques. At multiple sites, separated by thousands of miles and supposedly thousands of years, we find the same approach. Massive blocks cut and fitted with joints so tight that modern stonemasons are impressed. Not roughly fitted with mud or mortar holding them together, but precision joints that have lasted thousands of years. The tools required to achieve this level of precision with hard stone like granite or basalt would need to be more sophisticated than the copper and bronze tools we assume these cultures had access to. Yet there the stones are, cut and placed with undeniable precision. Then there's the astronomical alignment. Cultures separated by vast oceans and with supposedly no contact with each other all independently decided that tracking celestial movements with extreme precision was worth massive investments of time and resources. And they all achieved this tracking with similar levels of accuracy, using similar architectural methods, oriented to similar celestial phenomena. Either this is convergent evolution in architecture, separate cultures arriving at similar solutions to similar problems, or there was some kind of shared knowledge base that these cultures were drawing from. Now let's bring Antarctica back into this, because those geometric patterns connecting global sites aren't just interesting mathematical curiosities. They raise questions about what might be in Antarctica, and whether it's connected to these other ancient mysteries. If there are structures under the Antarctic ice, and if those structures were built using similar techniques to what we see at Giza or Machu Picchu, that would suggest either that Antarctica was inhabitable more recently than mainstream geology accepts, or that someone was building sophisticated structures in multiple locations around the globe during a time period that predates our current understanding of advanced civilization. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Antarctic ice have detected some genuinely puzzling features. We've already talked about the geometric patterns in thermal distribution and the magnetic anomalies, but there's another layer to this: the actual physical structures that radar has picked up beneath the ice. These aren't just natural rock formations or geological features. These are chambers, tunnels, and architectural spaces that have shapes and dimensions, suggesting they were carved or constructed rather than naturally formed. The walls of some of these spaces give radar returns that indicate smooth, regular surfaces, rather than the rough, irregular surfaces you'd expect from natural cave systems or ice formations. What makes these radar findings even more interesting is the material analysis from the few samples that have been obtained from the edges of these formations. We're talking about traces of crystalline structures, not natural quartz crystals that form through geological processes, but organized crystal arrays that have properties suggesting they could interact with electromagnetic fields in specific ways. The kind of crystal structures that, if you were an engineer designing systems to store or transmit energy, you might deliberately create because of their useful electrical properties. Some of the material samples that have leaked out of classified research programs show chemical compositions that are frankly weird for natural geological formations. Rare earth elements, the stuff that goes into modern electronics, semiconductors, and advanced batteries, showing up in combinations and ratios that don't match natural mineral deposits. You don't typically find neodymium, dysprosium, and other exotic elements concentrated together in the ratios you'd want if you were building advanced electronic components, unless someone deliberately refined and combined them that way. Now, the conventional explanation would be that these are just unusual natural mineral deposits that happen to have interesting electromagnetic properties and chemical compositions. Antarctica has a unique geological history. It was once part of ancient supercontinents. It's been subject to volcanic activity and various geological processes that could create unusual mineral formations. All of which is absolutely true and could explain individual anomalous samples. What's harder to explain is the pattern. Multiple sites with similar unusual compositions, combined with geometric architectural features, combined with electromagnetic properties that create measurable anomalies, all in locations that are geometrically related to other mysterious ancient sites around the globe. Let's talk about what these findings might mean if we take them at face value, even just as a thought experiment. If there are indeed artificial structures under Antarctic ice, and if those structures incorporate materials designed to interact with electromagnetic energy, that would suggest a level of technological sophistication that we don't associate with ancient civilizations. We're not talking about people figuring out how to smelt bronze or fire pottery. We're talking about people who understood electromagnetic fields well enough to engineer materials and structures that could manipulate them. That's not Stone Age technology. That's not Bronze Age technology. That's knowledge that in our timeline didn't develop until the Industrial Revolution and the age of electricity. Some researchers have proposed that these Antarctic structures might be remnants of a wireless energy transmission system. The idea sounds like science fiction. Wireless power was Tesla's dream and is only now becoming commercially practical with things like wireless phone charging. But if you had the right materials and understood the physics, you could theoretically create structures that act as resonators or transmitters for electromagnetic energy, allowing power to be distributed without wires over significant distances. The crystalline structures, the unusual mineral compositions, the geometric arrangements, these could all be components of such a system. And here's where it gets really speculative, but also kind of fascinating. If such a system existed and was global in scale, with nodes at multiple sites around the world all connected through electromagnetic resonance, that would explain the geometric relationships between ancient sites. They wouldn't just be randomly scattered monuments. They'd be parts of an integrated network, positioned precisely to maintain the geometric relationships necessary for the system to function. Antarctica could have been the central node, the power source or control hub for the entire network, with other sites acting as receivers, amplifiers, or distribution points. This is the kind of theory that makes mainstream archaeologists reach for the aspirin, and understandably so. We have no written records of such a system. We have no clear archaeological evidence of a global civilization with this level of technological sophistication. The timeline doesn't work with our understanding of when humans developed advanced technology. It requires assuming that either our dating methods are wrong, or that civilization is much older than we think, or that there was a global catastrophe that wiped out this advanced culture and set humanity back to primitive conditions. But, and here's where we have to be intellectually honest, the absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about structures buried under miles of ice that we're not allowed to fully investigate. If there was an advanced civilization, and it was destroyed by whatever catastrophe turned Antarctica from a habitable landmass into a frozen continent, most physical evidence would be buried, frozen, or eroded away over millennia. What we might expect to find would be exactly what we're seeing: fragmentary evidence, unusual material traces, geometric patterns that suggest organization, and lots of blank spaces where the full story used to be. The other thing to consider is that if such a civilization existed and met a catastrophic end, the survivors might have scattered to other parts of the world, taking whatever knowledge they could salvage with them. That could explain why we see similar building techniques and astronomical knowledge appearing in different cultures around the globe, not because these cultures were in regular contact with each other, but because they were all inheriting fragments of knowledge from a common earlier source. It would be like if our civilization collapsed today, and in a few thousand years future archaeologists were confused about why different survivor communities all had similar basic technologies and symbols, not realizing they were all drawing from the same pre-collapse knowledge base. Look, I'm not saying definitively that there was an ancient global civilization with advanced technology that had its central hub in Antarctica. What I am saying is that there are patterns, correlations, and anomalies that don't fit neatly into our current historical framework, and maybe we should be investigating these anomalies more thoroughly instead of dismissing them or restricting access to the areas where we might find answers. The geometric relationships between ancient sites are mathematically demonstrable. The similarities in construction techniques are well documented. The unusual materials and structures detected in Antarctica are confirmed by multiple independent surveys. Whether all of these things are connected or just coincidental is a question that deserves serious investigation. But that investigation keeps running into the same problems we've been discussing throughout this whole exploration of Antarctic mysteries. Access is restricted. Research is controlled. Findings that don't fit the mainstream narrative tend to get classified, dismissed, or buried in obscure journals where nobody will pay attention to them. The system isn't set up to answer these questions. It's set up to maintain the current understanding while appearing to support scientific inquiry. So we're left with tantalizing hints of something bigger: a global pattern of ancient sites with unexplained capabilities, geometric relationships that suggest coordinated planning, an Antarctic continent that might be the missing piece of the puzzle, material evidence that points toward technological sophistication we don't associate with ancient cultures, and an international framework that ensures we can't properly investigate any of it. Whether Antarctica was the central hub of an ancient global network, or just another mysterious site with unusual properties, the fact remains that we have questions without answers, and evidence we can't fully examine. And until that changes, Antarctica will remain not just a frozen continent at the bottom of the world, but a frozen question mark that challenges everything we think we know about human history and technological development. Just when you thought Antarctica couldn't get any stranger, we need to talk about time. Not geological time, not historical time, but actual moment-to-moment time that should be consistent, predictable, and generally well-behaved according to the laws of physics. Except in certain parts of Antarctica, time apparently didn't get the memo about how it's supposed to work. Research teams have reported incidents that sound like they're straight out of science fiction. Watches that suddenly jump forward or backward by hours, electronic timekeeping devices that give contradictory readings, and perhaps most unsettling, periods of missing time where expedition members have gaps in their memory with no explanation for what happened during those hours. Now, before we dive into theories about time portals and temporal anomalies, let's talk about the mundane explanations. Antarctica is harsh on equipment. Extreme cold can affect battery performance and electronic components. Electromagnetic interference, which we've already established is a major issue in certain Antarctic regions, can mess with digital displays and timekeeping circuits. People working in extreme conditions with minimal sunlight can experience disorientation and time distortion due to disrupted circadian rhythms. All perfectly reasonable explanations that would account for most reports of time weirdness if that's all we were dealing with. But here's the thing. The reports aren't just about malfunctioning watches or confused researchers losing track of time because they've been staring at white ice for 12 hours straight. We're talking about multiple independent timekeeping devices, both mechanical and electronic, all showing the same anomalous readings. We're talking about GPS systems, which depend on extremely precise timing to function, giving readings that don't make sense because the timing signals are off. We're talking about research teams who set out on documented expeditions with clear timestamps and return with logs and memories that don't match up with how much time actually passed. One particularly well-documented case involved a geological survey team working near the pole of inaccessibility, which is exactly what it sounds like, the point in Antarctica that's furthest from any coastline, and consequently, the most difficult place to reach. Not exactly a tourist hotspot, more like, if you end up here, you really meant to be here, because getting here by accident would be nearly impossible. This team set up equipment to measure gravitational variations, which is standard practice for understanding subsurface geology. What wasn't standard was what the equipment recorded. Gravitational fluctuations that shouldn't be possible given our understanding of how gravity works. Gravity is consistent. That's kind of its whole deal. Sure, it varies slightly based on altitude and local mass distribution, but these are predictable, measurable variations that follow known physics. What this team recorded were fluctuations in gravitational pull that cycled in patterns, changing over periods of minutes to hours, in ways that had no geological explanation. And here's where it connects to the time anomalies. Gravitational fields and time are related according to Einstein's general relativity. Strong gravitational fields can cause time dilation, the effect where time moves at different rates depending on the strength of gravity you're experiencing. It's a real phenomenon. It's been measured and verified. And it's why GPS satellites have to account for relativistic effects to maintain accuracy. But the gravitational variations needed to create noticeable time dilation effects are massive. You need black holes or neutron stars, not just unusual underground geology. The fluctuations recorded in Antarctica shouldn't be strong enough to affect time in any measurable way using natural geological explanations. Yet research teams working in these areas report time discrepancies, instrumentation failures, and that unsettling missing time phenomenon where they can't account for hours of their expedition. Either all of their equipment is simultaneously malfunctioning in identical ways, or something in those areas is genuinely affecting the flow of time in ways we don't have a conventional explanation for. The missing time reports are particularly strange because they're not just one person losing track of time. They're entire research teams with the same gaps. Everyone remembers arriving at a location. Everyone remembers the work they were doing. Then there's a period, sometimes several hours, where memories are fuzzy or absent, and when everyone compares notes, they all have the same gap at the same time. Their equipment logs show continuous operation through the gap, but the data from that period is often corrupted or nonsensical. It's like someone hit the pause button on that section of reality, edited some things, and then hit play again. Except the editing was done poorly enough that people notice something's off. Now, the conventional explanation for missing time experiences usually involves psychological factors, stress, fatigue, oxygen deprivation, all of which are valid concerns in Antarctic conditions. Human memory is notoriously unreliable, and in extreme environments, it becomes even more so. A group of people subjected to the same stressful conditions might have similar psychological responses, including memory gaps. This is a much more likely explanation than actual temporal anomalies, and most scientists studying these reports lean towards psychological and physiological causes rather than physics-defying alternatives. But, and you knew there was going to be a but, some of these incidents involve physical evidence that's harder to explain through psychology alone. Equipment that should have run for a certain duration shows different battery depletion than expected. Supplies that should have lasted for the documented time period are consumed at rates that don't match the timeline. Distance traveled according to GPS tracking doesn't align with the reported timeline and the speed at which the team was moving. These are objective measurements that don't rely on human memory or perception, and they suggest that something about the recorded timeline doesn't add up. There's also the matter of the objects that appear and disappear. Multiple expeditions have reported seeing structures, lights, or formations in the distance that vanish when approached, or that aren't visible on subsequent passes through the same area. Now, Antarctica is famous for optical illusions, mirages, fata morgana effects, ice formations that look like structures from certain angles. The atmosphere does weird things to light in polar regions, and what you think you're seeing might be a reflection, refraction, or projection from somewhere completely different. Experienced polar explorers know this and account for it, yet the reports persist from seasoned researchers who know better than to mistake ice glints for mysterious structures. Some researchers who've worked in Antarctica describe moments where the landscape seems wrong. Not dramatically different, but subtly off, like reality briefly hiccuped and reset slightly incorrectly. Shadows at wrong angles given the sun's position. Colors that seem oversaturated or washed out without explanation. A sense that spatial relationships between landmarks aren't quite right. These are subjective experiences, impossible to verify objectively, and easily dismissed as the effects of extreme environment on human perception. But the consistency of these reports across different expeditions, different time periods, and different individuals suggests that either Antarctic conditions produce very specific and repeatable perceptual distortions, or there's something about certain areas that genuinely affects how reality presents itself. Let's connect this to everything else we've discussed, because at this point we've assembled quite a collection of Antarctic mysteries. We have maps showing impossible knowledge. We have buried lakes with classified research results. We have military operations that ended mysteriously. We have thermal anomalies and geometric patterns. We have magnetic fields that disable electronics. We have international treaties with secret provisions. We have reports of artifacts and structures. We have geometric relationships to other ancient sites. We have evidence of advanced materials and potential energy systems. And now we have time anomalies and gravitational fluctuations in the same areas where all the other weird stuff is concentrated. If you're looking for a pattern, here it is. Everything strange about Antarctica clusters in specific zones. The magnetic anomalies aren't evenly distributed. The thermal anomalies form geometric patterns. The restricted access zones overlap with areas of unusual gravitational readings. The reported artifacts and structures are in the same general regions where time anomalies get reported. The areas that are off limits to research are the areas where all of these phenomena converge. Either this is an extraordinary coincidence where multiple unrelated natural phenomena happen to occur in the same locations, or there's a common cause linking all of these effects. Some researchers have proposed that what we're seeing are the residual effects of ancient technology, not primitive technology. Not they figured out how to move big rocks technology, but genuinely advanced systems that manipulated fundamental physical forces in ways we're only beginning to understand. If such technology existed and was catastrophically damaged or shut down, it might continue to produce measurable effects: electromagnetic anomalies from decaying power systems, thermal signatures from failing containment, gravitational distortions from collapsed field generators, and yes, possibly temporal effects from whatever systems were designed to do things we can't even conceive of because we haven't invented them yet. This sounds like science fiction, I know. It sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in movies about ancient aliens and lost civilizations. But consider what we actually know versus what we're told we know. We know Antarctica has anomalies that don't fit conventional explanations. We know there are structures detected beneath the ice that look artificial. We know there are materials with compositions suggesting deliberate engineering. We know there are geometric patterns connecting Antarctic sites to other mysterious locations globally. We know that access to investigate these phenomena is restricted by international agreement. We know that research findings in certain areas get classified. And we know that expedition teams report experiences that don't make sense within our standard understanding of how reality works. What we don't know is what's actually down there, because we're not allowed to look properly. And that's the real mystery of Antarctica. Not what we've discovered, but what we're being prevented from discovering. The great silence around Antarctic anomalies isn't silence because there's nothing to say. It's silence because someone decided that what's there shouldn't be widely known yet. Maybe for good reasons: environmental protection, preventing cultural panic, maintaining social stability. Maybe for bad reasons: protecting economic interests, maintaining power structures, keeping technological advantages secret. Or maybe for reasons we can't understand because we don't have the full picture of what's at stake. Think about what would happen if it was confirmed that there are remnants of an advanced civilization under Antarctic ice. Not just ruins of a primitive settlement, but evidence of technology that rivals or exceeds our current capabilities. That discovery would shatter fundamental assumptions about human history, technological development, and our place in the timeline of civilization. It would raise questions about what happened to that civilization, whether we're at risk of the same fate, and whether we're actually the first advanced human society or just the latest in a cycle. These are the kinds of questions that have implications for everything from religious doctrine to scientific paradigms to political power structures. Maybe that's why 54 countries could agree on the Antarctic Treaty so quickly and unanimously. Not because they're all altruistic protectors of pristine wilderness, but because they all had access to preliminary findings that made them realize that unrestricted access to Antarctica could destabilize the entire global order. Better to lock it down, control the information, and only allow research that stays within acceptable parameters. Better to maintain the official narrative while quietly studying the anomalies behind closed doors, where the findings won't cause panic or paradigm shifts. The ice in Antarctica is melting. Climate change is accelerating the process. And while the Antarctic ice sheet is massive enough that it won't disappear overnight, it is retreating and thinning in many areas. Within our lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes, things that have been buried for millennia might become exposed. Structures that currently require ice-penetrating radar to detect might become visible on the surface. Whatever is under that ice won't stay hidden forever. And then the question becomes, will the truth come out gradually through controlled disclosure, or will it be forced out by circumstance when climate change literally uncovers evidence that can't be dismissed or classified away? Here's what we can say with certainty. Antarctica is not just a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world. It's a continent with mysteries that challenge our understanding of history, technology, and possibly physics itself. It's governed by international agreements that restrict access and control information in ways that suggest those in power know more than they're sharing. It has anomalies, thermal, magnetic, gravitational, temporal, that cluster in patterns suggesting something more than natural geological variation. It may contain structures, artifacts, and technology from a civilization that predates our recorded history, and we're not allowed to properly investigate any of it. The silence around Antarctica isn't the silence of an empty frozen void. It's the silence of a secret being kept. Whether that secret is being kept to protect us or to control us is something we can't know without access to the classified information and restricted zones where the real discoveries have been made. What we can do is pay attention to what's publicly available, note the patterns in what's being hidden and restricted, and ask questions about why so much effort goes into controlling access to a supposedly empty continent at the bottom of the world. Antarctica has been waiting under its ice for millions of years. The truth about what's there has been waiting just as long. The question is whether humanity will get to that truth through deliberate investigation and disclosure, or whether the melting ice will force the truth out regardless of whether we're ready for it. Either way, the frozen continent isn't going to stay frozen forever, and whatever secrets it's keeping aren't going to stay secret indefinitely. So the next time you see Antarctica on a map, that big white blob at the bottom that everyone ignores because it seems irrelevant to daily life, remember that it might be the most important piece of real estate on the planet. Not for what it is now, but for what it was before the ice. What might still be under there, and what it might tell us about human history if we ever get the chance to look properly. Until then, we're left with fragments, anomalies, restricted zones, classified research, and a whole lot of questions that those in power seem very determined not to answer. The great silence around Antarctica speaks volumes, if you know how to listen. And what it's saying is that there's something down there significant enough that multiple nations, with competing interests and conflicting ideologies, all agreed to keep it quiet. That level of consensus doesn't happen by accident. It happens because everyone involved decided that maintaining the silence was more important than revealing the truth. And that decision tells us more about what's under the ice than any classified document ever could. Welcome to Antarctica, the frozen question at the bottom of the world, where time gets weird, reality hiccups, ancient mysteries lie buried, and the truth is locked behind treaties, restrictions, and a silence that's been maintained for over 60 years. The ice is melting, the secrets won't stay buried forever, and when the truth finally emerges, it's going to be interesting to see how the official story adjusts to accommodate evidence that's been hiding in plain sight all along. Thanks for joining me on this frozen deep dive. If this video made you question everything you thought you knew about that big white continent, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what you think is really going on down there. And subscribe if you want more deep dives into historical mysteries that don't quite add up. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the most interesting stories are the ones nobody wants you to hear.